I am Dr. Brian Ulrich. I am a professor of history at Shippensburg University. And the spelling of my name is, I guess, right there, Brian Ulrich.
All right, so Dr. Ulrich, let's talk a little bit about the broad. I want to go into the history 75 years back. And because from most people's understanding, they're seeing it in the media in the, I don't want to say the quantity, but its prevalence, like they never have before for a lot of people like me for the first time. But this isn't a new conflict. Like this did not spark out of, thin air.
No, definitely not.
So yeah, let's talk about some of the history, the Zionist movement, just so that our audience can kind of understand, okay, what happened before I was born, before a lot of them were born, and how do we get to where we are?
Okay, well, you mentioned the Zionist movement. So the Zionism, put simply, is Jewish nationalism. Zionism was a movement that arose in Europe in response to anti-Semitism there, really in the very late 1800s. And it is Zionism conceived the idea that the solution to anti-Semitism in Europe was for the Jewish people to have a homeland of their own, since they were being sort of excluded from people's sense of what Frenchness was or Germanness or some of these other nationalisms. And that wound up being conceived of as returning from a condition of diaspora to return to the land of Israel, which at that time was commonly called by the inhabitants Palestine, even though that wasn't like its own Ottoman province. It was a few separate provinces or parts of a larger one. And so you began to see from Europe immigration there to join what was an existing community of a few thousand, mainly very religious scholar Jews in Jerusalem and Hebron. And so this was the very late 1800s and into the 1900s. And you had a series of waves of immigration to Israel that were early on, I guess, sort of like the prehistory of the Israel that became an independent state in a war in 1948 and 49.
And so let's go there. 1948, 1949, we're talking post-World War II. I believe it was the British that had the control of that area that we all know today as, Israel, some of those other countries surrounding it, as well as, I believe, parts of Egypt, if I'm not mistaken.
Egypt is more complicated, but
so what happened there when the British decided after World War II, okay, we're going to leave? And then how did that lead to the Israel-Arab War that kind of drew the map that we know more of today?
Okay. So what happens in 1948 and 1949? You had, when you're dealing with Zionist immigration, you had an existing population of Palestinians. If you go back again to the very early 1900s or late 1800s, they would have been concentrated mainly in the uplands and the cities. And there's a sort of a climate shift happening in the 1800s that explains part of this and how it impacts the agricultural land. But what's happening here is that they had also been spreading onto the coastal plain at the same time. And so you had these populations as well. And when the British are pulling out, the new founded United Nations is attempting to determine what will be the disposition of this land. They propose a division into two separate states, an Arab-Palestinian state and a Jewish state. And what happens is that these are not quite the same boundaries we have now. The Jewish state would have had a somewhat narrow Jewish majority by the terms of what it actually became, whereas the Palestinian state would have been almost entirely Palestinian. And the Zionist leadership decided to accept this because, some of them were like, yes, we've got what we want. Other Zionists would have been more radical, but they were convinced, well, maybe this can be an intermediate step. The Arab world did not accept this because from their standpoint, this was not a UN decision to make, that they had come to see the Jewish settlers primarily as sort of a cat's paw of British colonialism. even though, of course, the Jewish settlers themselves would disagree. And so they thought this is not a UN decision to make. This has all been historically part of an Arab homeland. And so we shouldn't agree to have the UN carve it up like this. And this leads to a two-stage war. One war within mandatory Palestine, which was the British rule of Palestine there between World War I and World War II, that saw really a triumph of the Jewish population over the Palestinian population. And then this was followed by invasions from nearby Arab countries. Now, the Gaza Strip comes into existence out of this. Many of the Palestinians either fled because people flee war zones. Within central Israel, there were also some deliberate attempts to drive them out of areas that were seen as key strategic zones within Israel proper. And so many of them wind up as refugees. And one of the places they go is actually this narrow coastal strip between what becomes Israel and Egypt. And when the 1949 armistice lines are drawn, that is not included within the territory that will be administered by Israel. It is instead left under Egyptian administration. And it's actually specified within the armistice that the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel should not be seen as an international border, because Israel did not want to set the armistice lines as a final border. But that is where the Gaza Strip came from. And a good chunk of its population. There had been people previously living in Gaza, but it also winds up with a lot of refugees.
And so then I know there was, I believe, further conflicts in the 1960s. What were those about, and how did they kind of impact the trickle to, again, the conflicts that will end up happening in the early 2000s?
Well, what you're talking about there is primarily the Six-Day War of 1967. And in this war, you had Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser and Syria. And Egypt and Syria were in sort of a competition for which would be among the most prominent Arab state. There's always this competition among various Arab states for which of them is going to be most influential at the head of a common Arab identity. And one of the ways of achieving this was to show that you were standing up against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. And there was some direct conflict between Israel and Syria, related in part to water resources up in the north, and also just infiltration of Palestinians. There were some issues up north. Egypt, on the other hand, ever since the Sinai War, or the Suez Crisis, or whatever you want to call it, of 1956, had UN peacekeepers in the Sinai Peninsula. And so Nasser was essentially getting criticized by some Arab nationalists for hiding. It was called hiding behind the skirts of the UN, I believe. And so he starts issuing all these firm threats against Israel, that especially when you are at this point, you're only a generation past World War II. The Holocaust is still an important collective memory for the Jewish people, but in 1967, it is much closer in time. And so when somebody is threatening to drive you into the sea and so on, you take that very seriously. Now, Israel is only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. And so they developed a doctrine of preemptive warfare. Like, if we think we're going to get attacked, we have to strike first. And so they actually did strike first in the Six-Day War, as many Palestinians or Arabs would tell you. But this leads to them occupying not only the Gaza Strip, but the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights of Syria as well. And this is where the idea of the occupied territories comes from, even though it was in the Camp David Accords in the late 1970s that Sinai was returned to Egypt.
And so, yeah, you mentioned the Camp David Accords. There's been several, as far as I understand, several instances where the US or other countries have come in to kind of resolve these issues. I think that's an important part for people to know, is that, hey, this is not something that the United States is just hopping into now. We've been in this theater quite a bit with diplomacy, and I use the word diplomacy relatively loosely because, again, it's complicated. Can you touch on those?
No, well, there have been many thick books written with immense detail about all these efforts to resolve the conflict. One thing that does come out of 1967 is the Land for Peace formula, which is implied in the UN resolution on that conflict. And so the Land for Peace formula has been what dictated a lot of the discussion between Israel, the Arab states, and the Palestinians for the decades following the war. And, the Camp David Accords was part of that. It is the return to Sinai that is a key part of the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal. And, if you were to have peace between Israel and Syria, Syria would want the return of the Golan Heights, though Israel has been far more reluctant to potentially give up the Golan Heights than Sinai. And similarly with the idea of a Palestinian state that emerged, that would be on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, according to advocates of the two-state solution.
Now let's talk about I believe it's the Oslo Accords. That was kind of the big next development. That was in the 90s. Let's hit that. So what were those, and what was that development like for that region?
The Oslo Accords were one of the main things that this was in the 1990s. Everybody was very optimistic then about being able to settle lots of conflicts and create a new world order in the aftermath of the Cold War. And the Oslo Accords were essentially, what they essentially served to do is to create, they were conceived of as an interim agreement that would start a process of further negotiations. You created something called a Palestinian National Authority, and this was going to have authority over part of the occupied territories. And you had this plan to lay out negotiations and solve further issues that would lead to the emergence of a Palestinian state, allegedly within 5 years. Obviously, that kept getting extended. And I want to talk, because we can talk sort of generally about an Oslo era of lots of peace talks and happening. And one thing that is part of this era is something, well, actually, let me introduce Hamas here. So Hamas emerged in the 1980s. Okay, and it emerged in the Gaza Strip. That was its base at the time. And it emerged as an Islamist organization that posed a challenge to the more secular nationalist Fatah, which was the dominant faction of the PLO, the main sort of representatives of the Palestinians in international affairs. And it is Fatah and the PLO that are doing the negotiation and will take over the Palestinian National Authority under Oslo. So Hamas was therefore sort of on the outside, and they were very radical. This is, Hamas, it's a very anti-Semitic organization. I have no qualms about saying that, just based on partly their charter, but you get into some of the rhetoric that comes from sermons in Hamas mosques and so on as well. They pick up on lots of themes of Western anti-Semitism. But anyway, there was a term that came to be used in the Oslo years, again, late 90s, and I would extend this maybe into the early 2000s as well, called the bomber's veto. The bomber's veto is whenever the negotiations seem to be getting too serious and it seems like there might be a breakthrough, there will usually be a terrorist attack that that sort of drives a wedge between the parties, so that even those who negotiate don't feel comfortable negotiating because relations got so bad in relation to the terrorist attack and the retaliation. And Hamas was part of this. They have long been opponents of the peace process. And because the peace process ultimately failed, and you can say like people were trying to have negotiations even into the Obama administration, but you can look back and think that really, even in the early 2000s, it was not going anywhere. And this led Israel to undertake a process of disengagement, okay, unilateral disengagement. And this is when Israel in 2005 withdraws its settlements and occupying troops from within the territory of the Gaza Strip, though they did maintain control of its borders and airspace and sea areas. And that is key context for getting where we are today.
I wanted to talk
that?
about, yeah, we're good on that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Israeli military and its, again, control of the Gaza Strip borders, its control and influence in the West Bank. I was speaking today with Palestinian Americans. I've spoken with Israeli Americans over the last few weeks. From what it seems, it's from the Palestinian American side of things. There is a limited mobility because of that control of the borders, because of their, like you said, almost that disengagement type of response. So I wanted to touch on that and then touch on the last 16 years in the Gaza Strip, which I know, again, we're condensing a lot here, but
absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
such is history.
Many long books have been written about all of this, of course. So Israel, again, withdrew from the Gaza Strip, but they did not negotiate any sort of handoff within the Gaza Strip with the Palestinian National Authority. And so it wound up being sort of a power vacuum. Now, at the same time, for reasons we don't need to go into, you wind up with Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. I believe that was the year. These Palestinian legislative elections were in the aftermath, ultimately, of Yasser Arafat, who died in late 2004 and was the longtime Palestinian leader. Now, in these legislative elections, there was a bit of a shocker because Hamas wound up having a legislative majority. Now, they did not get a majority of the votes, and in fact, a lot of their vote total, and it was 44% for proportional seats and then around 36% for individual constituencies, was made up of people who were voting against Fatah as a protest, because Fatah had become, and still is, extremely corrupt. It was seen ultimately as ineffective. It was seen all about just kind of like, trying to profit off of international aid and siphon off that international aid into people's pockets. And so people would vote for Hamas as a protest. But then, shocking even Hamas, they emerged with a legislative majority. And the various other powers, Fatah, Israel, the United States, and so on, essentially said, we don't want Hamas to control this legislature. And so there were ways to kind of prevent them from taking seats and so on, which ultimately led Hamas to simply seizing control of the Gaza Strip in the summer of 2007, which I remember it happening because I was in Jerusalem at that time. But yes, they were. So that is when Hamas comes to rule the Gaza Strip. And it is in the context of this Hamas takeover. And also, I believe before 2007, actually, back in 2006, an Israeli army private was kidnapped and was held hostage in the Gaza Strip. And so it is all about this time that Israel starts putting Gaza Strip under what people call like the siege of Gaza or whatever, not allowing much in at all, controlling movement in and out, because particularly because after 2007, it again becomes a Hamas-controlled territory, which is then the scene periodically of always potential and sometimes actual attacks on the surrounding areas of southern Israel. Okay, Hamas would launch rockets, for example. And so you have a series of military operations on Israel's part against the Gaza Strip. And because the Gaza Strip is so densely settled, this is getting into some military matters that probably require more detailed knowledge. Suffice it to say that Hamas is not above storing materials in mosques, for example, so that then if you're going to attack their military stuff, you're going to wind up having to attack what are sympathetic targets on the part of the world, like why are you attacking a religious building? On the other hand, there are elements in the Israeli government as well who would like, because the current Israeli government, I don't want to say this is true of all Israeli governments, but the current Israeli government definitely has hardliners who would like to sort of undo the disengagement and put settlers back in the Gaza Strip as part of a larger Israeli homeland. And so I've kind of lost where I'm going with this. But hopefully what I'm getting across is that it's been an ugly situation. You have 2 million or more people in Gaza who are living in what has been called the world's largest open air prison, essentially ruled by Hamas and subject to Israeli raids because of the flare-ups that happened between Hamas and, again, southern Israel. And there was one more bit I wanted to add, and I forget what it was. But I think to give you an example of because this is a very sympathetic group, and this to me is a lot of Gaza civilians, just like I would be sympathetic toward Israeli civilians. One thing you will hear is that Hamas won this election, but then almost half of Gazans are under 18 years of age. So they weren't around for the 2006 legislative elections, at least as voters. Some of them would have been toddlers. But then also you will hear that, polls show that they would rather be ruled by Hamas than Fatah today. And this is true, but it's also not that simple, because if you give them more options, their favorite option is none of the above. They don't like it. They're not, the plurality goes to, we prefer neither Hamas nor Fatah, nor any of the other Palestinian factions. And so to a great extent, they're caught under Hamas's rule, which has in many ways also become corrupt, just like Fatah's did, and now paying the price for Hamas's attack on Israel.
To touch on, you had mentioned briefly, there's differences in the Israeli governments, who's governed over the years. Under the current administration, you hear Palestinian Americans and you hear stories of and almost like an aggression and a more aggressive government from the Israelis onto the Palestinians. They're settling in the West Bank. They're again strengthening the grip on the Gaza Strip. And so how has that played a role as well in this wider conflict?
So if you look at Israeli politics, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, has taken a political hit from what happened on October the 7th, because for two reasons. One is that he seems to have redeployed some military assets from the south to the West Bank in support of West Bank settlers who are not popular with the majority of Israelis. If they're ideological settlers, there are settlers who are just there because they live there. But the other point is that also he seems to have been willing to play up Hamas to prevent Fatah from becoming a negotiating partner. And so he seems to have said, he allowed more work visas, for example, for Gazans to come into Israel for employment purposes. And the idea seems to have been that we can keep Gaza calm and we can keep it under Hamas rule. We can keep the West Bank under the rule of, the by now well-aged Mahmoud Abbas. He's 87 and he is nearing you're starting to see a very lame duck situation in Fatah. And therefore, we won't have to worry about the Palestinian issue because they will be too divided that we won't have pressure to negotiate. And instead, we can focus on forming diplomatic relations or establishing diplomatic relations with other Arab states that have long had views on the conflict, but it's not a central issue to them, such as Saudi Arabia, which one that a lot of people were talking about here in 2023. And so to a lot of Israelis, this policy seems not to have worked at keeping Israel safe. And there is definitely the sentiment that maybe we don't want to change prime ministers right now, but afterward that there will probably be a reckoning, as there was following another Arab-Israeli war in 1973, when the prime minister was seen as not having properly anticipated the attack.
And it's almost like, I hear the cycle of violence. From what I'm hearing, it's almost as if history continues to repeat itself, does it not?
Well, as a historian, I would say that history never truly repeats itself, but there are definitely patterns you will see. And so, yes, and you could even say, again, so if you look at the idea of peace happening between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which people were, again, talking about as perhaps imminent as recently as last month, and now nobody is talking about that. And that is one theory as to what Hamas was trying to accomplish, though I don't think we know for sure.
And so then, culminating a lot that we just talked about, where do we go from here? The United States providing aid to Israel. They vowed to defend an ally. They also are trying to get humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in that narrow, like you said, it's been described as an open air prison. You know, there's these other geopolitical factors moving. It's a lot to keep track of. So realistically, you know, the people in Harrisburg, the people in York, Lancaster, you know, where do we all go from here? You know, what does this all mean for us at home?
I unfortunately don't have any good solutions. I don't see a resolution happening in the near future. I don't believe that a two-state solution is still viable for a lot of reasons. And so I am simply in a situation where I hope that, you know, I hope that as many people as possible are able to come through this with something resembling their lives intact. But it is very dispiriting to watch, and that's an understatement, certainly.
Dr. Ulrich, I know there's, again, so much to unpack here. Is there first question, anything that we didn't touch on that's important for our audience to know? I plan on hopefully sharing this whole interview, besides me stumbling my name in the beginning. You know, is there anything that we didn't touch on that is important for them to know?
Probably, but I'm not entirely sure what it would be.
Second question to that, where could people like me who are younger, are trying to understand the history, understand the context in which this situation has arisen, where would we be best suited to find some answers?
I think, again, well, then there are a lot of good books written. I could recommend, if people read books, there's one by James Galvin called, I think, The Israel-Palestine Conflict, that's somewhere behind me. There's one by Neil Kaplan that has a very similar name. It's like actually Galvin's book, I think it's the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Neil Kaplan's is the Israel-Palestine Conflict, Contested Histories. I've used both at different times in my teaching here. And, you know, there's one by Ian Black. I forget the name of it. So there are a lot of good books that have been written that I think are fairly even-handed, that will give you just a sense of what's happening, how both Israelis and Palestinians can see themselves as victims and definitely have a good case. One of the books is actually called Righteous Victims, because both sides have a good claim to have been victimized by the other. And so I guess being a history professor, I automatically jump to books as where you should look. But they're definitely out there.